Everyone in Red Hollow said Silas Boone would marry money. They were wrong, and it nearly got him killed. The night Silas walked into that seamstress's lantern-lit doorway, soaked to the bone and bleeding through his coat, nobody in town knew it would be the decision that split Red Hollow straight down the middle. They laughed at him. They threatened him. A man with his land, his cattle, his reputation, choosing her? A woman who couldn't afford new boots? Who patched other people's worn-out lives while her own fell apart at the seams? Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. Hit like, and don't you dare leave before the end. Red Hollow, Colorado Territory. Autumn, 1883. The cold came early that year. It rolled down from the mountains sometime in late September, ahead of schedule and meaner than anyone remembered, settling over Red Hollow like a debt nobody wanted to pay. The creek that fed the eastern pastures dropped to a trickle. Grass turned brittle and colorless. Cattle stood motionless in the fields with their heads low and their ribs beginning to show, and the men who owned them stood on their porch rails and stared at the horizon as if looking hard enough might bring rain. It didn't. Red Hollow was not a pretty town. It had never been. It had been carved out of necessity rather than vision. A cluster of timber buildings and hard-packed streets wedged between a bluff to the north and a stretch of open rangeland that seemed to go on until it hit the edge of the world. There was one general store, one saloon that doubled as a courthouse when the circuit judge came through, a church that leaked when it rained, and enough stubborn, suspicious people packed into its borders to make sure nobody ever got too comfortable. The town had a hierarchy the way all small places do. At the top sat the ranchers, men like Gerald Holt, who owned the biggest cattle operation in the valley and made sure everyone knew it. Below them came the merchants, the foremen, the skilled tradesmen. And at the bottom, in the cracks where the light didn't reach, lived people like Mara Quinn. Mara occupied a narrow building at the far end of Settlers Row, wedged between an unused livery and a collapsed storage shed that nobody had bothered to tear down. The sign above her door read, "Quinn's Alterations and Repair," in hand-painted letters that were starting to flake. She did not make dresses for weddings or fashion shirts for the wealthy. She fixed things, split seams, blown-out elbows, boots whose soles had separated from their uppers. She worked with what people brought her, and people brought her the worst of what they owned. She was 28 years old, heavy-set in a way that the town felt entitled to comment on, and she had learned years ago that the best policy in Red Hollow was invisibility. Keep your head down. Do your work. Don't give people a reason to look at you, because when they looked at her, they rarely saw anything they chose to be kind about. She had one lantern, one good needle she treated like it was made of silver, a small iron stove that ate through wood faster than she could afford to buy it, and a cat named Buckwheat who contributed nothing to the household economy but sat on the windowsill every morning like he owned the place, which Mara privately thought showed better sense than most people she'd met. Silas Boone rode into Red Hollow on a Thursday afternoon in early October with a torn coat and a mood that matched the weather. He was 34, lean and weathered the way men get when they've spent more years outdoors than in, with the kind of quiet that people sometimes mistook for arrogance. He wasn't arrogant, he was careful. There was a difference. He'd learned to be careful the way most men in his profession learned things. Through loss. Lost cattle. Lost partners. A lost brother to a winter crossing 3 years back that Silas still didn't talk about. He'd come to Red Hollow 8 months ago to purchase grazing rights on the eastern pasture land and had stayed longer than he intended. That happened sometimes with places. They caught hold of you when you weren't paying attention. His coat, a heavy canvas duster he'd owned for 6 years, had been torn along the left shoulder seam during a fence repair 2 days prior. He'd wrapped a strip of leather around it as a temporary fix, which had worked exactly as well as temporary fixes usually do. By the time he reached town, the shoulder seam had opened another 3 inches, and the lining had begun pulling away from the hem in a manner that let the wind straight through. He'd meant to ride past Quinn's Alterations. He wasn't sure why he pulled up instead. The shop window was small and slightly crooked in its frame. Through it, he could see the yellow glow of a lantern and the silhouette of a woman bent over a work table. He sat on his horse for a moment in the cold, watching without meaning to. She was focused completely on whatever was in her hands, the kind of focus that makes a person forget they exist in a public space. Her sleeves were pushed to her elbows. Her hair, dark and thick, was pinned back in a way that had mostly failed. A strand hung across her cheek, and she didn't bother pushing it away. Silas dismounted, tied his horse to the post, and pushed open the door. A small bell above the door announced him. The woman looked up. She had a direct gaze, not unfriendly, but not eager either. The kind of look that had learned not to expect much from a person walking through the door. Her hands stilled on her work, a man's jacket she'd been reinforcing along the pocket seams. "Help you?" she said. "Coat's torn." He held out his arm to show her the shoulder. It was not the most articulate explanation he'd ever given, but it covered the situation. She set down the jacket and stood. She was not tall. She crossed the small room and looked at his shoulder with a professional directness that reminded him, oddly, of how a good veterinarian assessed an animal. No judgment, no performance, just looking. "Canvas," she said. "Old tear or fresh?" "Fence post, day before yesterday." She turned his shoulder slightly, not asking permission, which he didn't mind. "Lining's coming loose on the bottom, too." "I noticed. I can do it tonight if you leave it." "How much?" She paused. Something moved across her face, a small calculation. "Coat's been with you a while," she said, almost to herself, examining the wear patterns around the collar and cuffs. 6 years. He blinked. "About that. People who keep coats that long generally take care of things." She set the shoulder down. $1.50. It was a fair price. He'd expected her to charge more, given she was the only seamstress in Red Hollow. He shrugged out of the coat and handed it over. "Name?" she asked, moving to her work table and laying it flat to examine the damage in full. "Silas Boone." She looked up again briefly. She'd heard the name, but everyone in Red Hollow had heard the name. She showed no particular reaction to it, which he found, without quite knowing why, refreshing. "Mara Quinn," she said. "Come back tomorrow morning." He came back the next morning. The coat was done. The shoulder seam was not just repaired, but reinforced. She'd added a second line of stitching inside the first, along a stress line he hadn't noticed was weakening. The lining at the hem was reattached, and he realized she'd also repaired a fraying section near the cuff that he hadn't mentioned and hadn't even noticed until he put the coat back on and felt the difference. He checked the interior pocket where he'd left his payment the previous evening when he dropped it off. The money was still there, untouched. He held up the coin. "You forgot this." She was already back at her work table, working on something else. She didn't look up. "I didn't forget it." "Then what?" The cuff repair took 5 minutes. She kept her eyes on her work. Shoulder job was straightforward. $1.50 was already fair. "I don't charge for 5 minutes." Silas stood in the doorway of her small shop holding the $1.50 in his hand, and something shifted in his chest that he couldn't immediately name. It wasn't attraction exactly. Not yet. It was more like the feeling of finding your footing on ground you expected to be soft and discovering it was solid all the way down. "Most people would have charged extra," he said. "I'm not most people." She finally glanced up and there was no pride in her voice, just fact. "You need anything else?" He thought about it. "Not right now," he said, and put the coin in his pocket and left. He came back 4 days later. Not everyone in Red Hollow was watching when Silas Boone started making excuses to walk past Quinn's alterations on his way to the feed store, but enough people were. Red Hollow was the kind of town where observation was treated as both sport and civic duty. There were women, in particular, who had elevated this to a genuine art form, the way they could track a man's movements through the settlement through nothing more than glances exchanged across the street, conversations paused at exactly the right moment, windows that happened to face the right direction. The widow Hetty Vance, for example, knew within 48 hours that Silas Boone had visited the seamstress's shop twice. She mentioned this to Clara Whitmore over coffee, in the tone people use when they're pretending not to care about something they care about enormously. Hetty Vance was 51, handsome in the sharp-featured way that some women grow into after enough hard years, and she owned 300 acres of the best grazing land in the valley. Her first husband had left her that land. Her grief had lasted approximately 14 months, after which she'd become very focused on practical matters, of which the most pressing was that running 300 acres alone was difficult, and she was, in her own estimation, too sensible and too well-resourced to remain single longer than necessary. Silas Boone had seemed to Hetty like the obvious solution. She'd made her interests clear in the understated way she considered appropriate. Dinners that happened to require his input, fences that conveniently needed his professional opinion, a basket of goods that appeared on his porch one morning with no note attached because she felt notes were slightly desperate. He'd been polite. He'd been nothing but polite. Which was, she was beginning to understand, not the same thing as interested. "He went in again yesterday," Clara Whitmore said, stirring her coffee with the deliberate slowness of someone savoring the conversation. Clara was younger than Hetty, rounder in the face, and took a more openly delighted approach to the town's business. "Stayed for nearly an hour, they say." "Nobody says anything," Hetty replied. "People imagine things." "My nephew walks that street every afternoon." Clara looked at her over the rim of her cup. "He doesn't imagine." Hetty set down her cup with the careful precision of a woman managing her expression. "There's nothing to discuss. The Quinn woman has something he needs repaired. That's the entirety of it." "She repaired his coat in one visit. What's he going back for?" The question sat on the table between them. Neither woman answered it. What Silas was going back for was conversation. This surprised him more than anyone. He was not by nature a conversationalist. He'd spent large portions of the last decade largely in his own head, in the company of cattle and horses and men who communicated in grunts and nods, and the occasional complete sentence. He'd grown comfortable with silence the way some men grow comfortable with a limp. After a while, you stop noticing it. But Mara Quinn talked to him differently than anyone else in Red Hollow, which was to say, she talked to him like he was a regular person rather than a resource to be cultivated. She didn't compliment his land. She didn't ask about his plans. She didn't laugh too hard at the things he said or look at him with that particular calculating warmth that he'd come to recognize from the women in town who decided he represented a solution to something. She argued with him, not aggressively, but directly. The third time he came by, they got into a genuine disagreement about the durability of different saddle leathers, and she held her position against his even when he pushed back, which he did partly to test it and partly because he was curious what she'd do. What she did was produce a piece of bridle leather from under her counter, point to the stitching pattern along the edge, and explain in precise terms why her assessment was correct. She was right. He told her so. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to work. "You ever do saddle work?" he asked. "Occasionally, if someone asks." "I've got a saddle that needs the girth strap looked at." She looked up at him over her work with an expression that was equal parts wary and amused. "You've been here 3 times in 2 weeks, Mr. Boone." "Silas. You've been here 3 times in 2 weeks, Silas. That coat only needed 1 visit." He sat on the stool she kept near the counter for customers waiting on work. "I know that." She was quiet for a moment, running a seam between her fingers to check the tension. "People are going to talk," she said finally, not looking up. "People talk regardless," he said. "I stopped factoring that into my decisions some years ago." She looked up then. There was something in her expression he couldn't fully read. Not quite disbelief, but something close to it, like she was deciding whether he understood what he was saying. "It's different," she said carefully, "when the talking is about someone who can't afford to ignore it." The words landed. He stayed with them. "I know it is," he said. She studied him for a long moment. Then she looked back down at her work. "Bring the saddle in Thursday," she said. "Girth straps I can turn around same day." October deepened and the drought held, and Red Hollow grew collectively anxious in the way that agricultural communities do when the weather turns hostile. A low-grade, constant dread that settled into every conversation and every transaction and every glance at the sky. The creek dropped further. Gerald Holt, who owned the largest herd in the valley, began trucking water in from a spring 12 miles east, and the cost of that showed in his face every morning when he walked into the saloon for his first cup of coffee. Smaller ranchers were selling off stock early, taking lower prices rather than risk losing animals to thirst and starvation over a winter that was already arriving ahead of schedule. And then the disappearances started. Not people, cattle. 3 head from the Miller Ranch on a Wednesday, found simply. Gone. No tracks worth following, no hole in the fence. 7 from the cutter spread the following week, and this time there were tracks, but they vanished into the rocky ground north of the canyon and didn't resume anywhere anyone could find them. The town meeting that followed was held at the saloon on a Tuesday evening, and it was not a calm affair. Silas sat near the back, not because he didn't have opinions, but because he wanted to hear what people said before he offered any. This was a habit he'd developed over years of range disputes. The first 20 minutes of a community meeting generally told you more about the actual problem than any of the proposed solutions. What he heard in the first 20 minutes was fear wearing the costume of certainty. "It's the Harlan gang," said Bert Cutter, whose missing cattle had not improved his temperament. "Everybody knows they've been working the territory north of the pass." "Harlan hasn't been seen in 3 years," said Gerald Holt, which was true, but said with the authority of a man who considered his opinion self-evidently superior. "Then it's someone like Harlan. Could be independent operators. Drought pushes men to desperate measures." This from Will Sayers, who ran the feed store and tended toward the philosophical view of human behavior, which was not what Bert Cutter wanted to hear. "I don't care about their circumstances," Cutter said. "I care about my cattle." The meeting went around for another hour without resolution. A watch rotation was proposed and accepted. The sheriff, a man named August Reese, who was competent but understaffed, promised to ride the northern perimeter daily. Everyone went home slightly more frightened than when they'd arrived, which is sometimes the only real output of community meetings. Silas rode back through town slowly. He passed Quinn's alterations. The light was still on, long past when most people were awake. He didn't stop, but he noticed. He told her about this meeting the next day. Not planning to, just it came up. They'd gotten into the habit, somewhere in the previous 3 weeks, of talking while she worked. He'd sit on the customer stool, and she'd keep her hands moving, and they'd talk about things in the way that people do when they've quietly decided they trust each other without making any formal announcement of it. "Harlan gang," she said, not looking up from the boot she was resoling. "That's what Bert Cutter thinks." Bert Cutter doesn't think. He reacts. She smoothed the sole flat with her thumb. "Harlan's been gone too long. If it were his people, they'd be bolder. These disappearances are patient. Careful." Silas looked at her. "What do you mean, patient? 3 head, then nothing for a week. Then 7, then nothing." She finally glanced up. Someone who was just desperate would take what they could and move fast. This is someone who's watching how the town responds before deciding how much to push. He was quiet for a moment. "You figured that out from the town meeting?" "I didn't go to the town meeting." She set the boot down and picked up the next. "I hear things. People bring their clothes in and they talk. Half of them don't notice I'm listening." A small pause. "You learn a lot when people forget you're in the room." Silas thought about that. He thought about it for the rest of the day. What he recognized, sitting with it, was that what Mara had just done in 30 seconds was something that the entire town meeting, with its authority and volume and absolute certainty about the Harlan gang, had failed to do. She'd looked at the shape of the problem instead of the obvious surface of it. He came back the following morning. "What else do you know?" he asked, without preamble. She didn't pretend not to understand the question. She set down her needle. "Sit down," she said. "Bosti." They talked for 2 hours that morning, the longest they'd talked without interruption. What emerged from that conversation was less a specific theory and more a collection of observations that Mara had been accumulating without knowing exactly what to do with them. The cattle were disappearing from the north and east, never from the south pastures, which sat closer to the canyon trails. A man named Dale Wick, who worked as a foreman on Gerald Holt's spread, had been absent from the saloon 4 nights running, unusual for a man known for his habits. 3 weeks ago, she'd repaired a saddlebag belonging to a man she didn't recognize, who'd paid in cash and been in a significant hurry. And the bag had smelled of something she couldn't identify that she later realized was tallow, the kind used to waterproof canvas when you were expecting to be in wet terrain. "That could be nothing," she said carefully. "I'm not saying it's something. But you thought about it." "I think about everything." She picked up her needle again. "I don't have a lot else to do." There was something in the way she said it, not self-pity, but just the flat acknowledgement of a person who lives alone and works long hours in a small room. He felt unexpectedly a twist of something uncomfortable in his chest. "Wick?" he said. You're sure about the 4 nights? Clara Whitmore's youngest works the bar on weekends. She mentioned it to a woman who comes in for alterations. Mara looked up at him. I told you, people talk. They just don't talk to me directly. Why not? She looked at him with an expression so patient it was almost pitying. You know why not. He did. He didn't want to. I'm going to look into Wick, he said. Be careful how you do it. She was already looking back at her work. If I'm wrong, you've accused an innocent man. If I'm right, you're poking at something that might poke back harder. Good advice. You don't have to say that like you're surprised. I'm not surprised, he said, which was only half true. He was surprised, not that she was capable, but that he'd found her here, in this small shop, in this hard-edged town, giving away capability the way she gave away labor, to people who hadn't thought to value it. Well, he did not go straight to look into Wick. He went first to have a conversation he'd been putting off with Hetty Vance. He'd been putting it off because he was, at base, a person who disliked causing pain, even to people who made it difficult to feel sympathetic toward them. And because, until recently, he hadn't been entirely certain of what he was doing or why. He was certain now. Hetty Vance received him in her parlor with a composure so studied it was nearly elegant. She was dressed better than the occasion warranted, which told him she'd been expecting this call. Mrs. Vance, he said, because calling her Hetty had always felt like an implication he wasn't comfortable making. Silas. She smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. Coffee? No, thank you. I won't be long. He stayed standing, which she noted, a social signal she understood immediately. I wanted to speak with you directly, rather than let things drift on in a way that might not be fair to you. A slight tightening around her jaw. She remained seated. Go on. I think you've had some expectations, and I've probably not done enough to address them. I should have been clearer, earlier. I apologize for that. You're a free man, she said, her voice perfectly controlled. You don't owe me clarity. Still, it would have been better. He paused. I'm not in a position to be what you're looking for, Mrs. Vance, and I think you deserve to know that plainly, from me, rather than hear it secondhand. She was quiet for a moment. Something moved under her composure, hurt, maybe, or pride, which in some women were nearly indistinguishable. It's the Quinn woman, she said. He didn't confirm it or deny it. It's my own decision, he said, made for my own reasons. She stood. She walked to the window with her arms crossed. When she spoke again, her voice was still controlled, but had shed some of its social warmth. You're making a mistake, she said, not because of who she is, but because of what this town will do with it. They'll make it hard for you, Silas, harder than you're imagining. I know that. And you don't care. He considered it honestly. I care less about it than I care about the alternative, he said. She was quiet for a long time, looking out the window at the dry fields. I hope she knows what she has, Hetty said finally. It was the most genuine thing she'd said in the conversation, and it cost her to say it. He could hear that. I'm not sure she does yet, he said. I'm working on that. He left her standing at the window and rode back into town with the feeling of a man who has just set something down that he'd been carrying for too long without deciding to. It was the day he walked into Quinn's alterations with a purpose that had nothing to do with coats or saddles that everything changed between them, and not because of the words he said, because of the ones she did. She looked up when he walked in. She read his face the way she read wear patterns in fabric, systematically, accurately. What happened? She said. Nothing bad. I went to see Hetty Vance. She went very still. I told her clearly where things stood, he said, or where they don't stand. Mara set down her work with a deliberateness that he recognized as her version of composure under pressure. Her voice was even and careful. Silas, I need you to understand something. All right. I have survived in this town by not giving people ammunition. She looked at him directly. The moment this becomes a public thing, whatever this is, I become a target, not you, me. You're Silas Boone. You'll hear some noise and people will move on. I'll hear it for the rest of the time I live here. Do you understand that? Yes, he said. You said it like you understand it. I'm asking if you actually do. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was slowly. I understand that there are two choices. One is that whatever this is stays private and uncertain until it eventually dies from lack of air. The other is that it becomes real and public, and you take most of the damage from that, and I take some of it. He met her eyes. I'm not asking you to take damage. I'm saying I think you're worth whatever this costs. And I'm asking if you think the same about me. The shop was very quiet. Buckwheat shifted on the windowsill, creating a small distraction that neither of them acknowledged. Mara looked at him for a long time with those direct, careful eyes. You're going to have to be patient, she said finally. I don't trust easily. I know. And I'm not someone who... She stopped. She pressed her lips together. There was something in her expression that was trying very hard to be controlled and not quite managing it. People don't look at me the way you're looking at me. I don't know what to do with it. You don't have to do anything with it right now, he said. I'm not going anywhere. She looked at him another moment. Then she looked back down at her work. Her hands were not quite steady. Thursday, she said quietly. Come for supper on Thursday. He nodded once. I'll be here, he said, and left her to her work before either of them could complicate it further. Outside, the wind was cold and sharp, and the sky was the color of an old bruise, promising another dry week. The creek would drop further. The cattle situation would worsen. Whatever was happening with Dale Wick and the canyon trails would have to be looked into. All of that was true, and all of it was waiting. But for the first time in longer than he could easily remember, Silas Boone walked through a hard wind in a hard season and did not feel any particular weight to the world. He had somewhere to be on Thursday. The night before that Thursday supper, 3 more ranches reported missing cattle, and someone had started watching Mara Quinn's shop from the alley across the street after dark. Neither of them knew that yet. Thursday came the way difficult things often do, too quickly and with bad weather attached. The wind had shifted overnight, pulling in something colder from the northwest that made the air smell like metal and coming snow. Silas rode into town earlier than he'd planned, not because he was eager, though he was, in a way he found mildly inconvenient, but because he'd woken before dawn with the uneasy feeling that something was wrong and hadn't been able to shake it. He tied his horse at the post near the feed store and stood for a moment in the gray morning, watching the street. Red Hollow was not yet fully awake. The saloon was dark. The general store had its shutters half open. A dog crossed the far end of the street at a trot, heading somewhere with specific purpose. Everything looked normal. Silas had learned, over years of watching for trouble on open range, that everything looking normal was sometimes the most suspicious thing of all. He walked the length of Settlers Row slowly, hands in his coat pockets, not heading anywhere in particular except in the general direction of Quinn's alterations. The shop was still closed at this hour, which it should have been. The sign above the door moved slightly in the wind. The window was dark. But in the alley directly across the street, the one that ran between the collapsed storage shed and the back of Will Sayers' feed store, there was a disturbance in the mud that hadn't been there the day before. Boot prints. 2 sets, overlapping. Someone had stood there for a while, facing the shop, then left in the direction of the north road. Silas crouched and looked at the prints without touching them. The heel pattern on one set was distinctive. A repair on the right boot, the sole worn through on the interior edge and replaced with a harder leather that left a cleaner mark in soft ground. He'd seen that pattern before recently, without registering it consciously. He stood. He thought. Then he walked to the saloon, which was just beginning to open, and asked the barman a question about Dale Wick. The barman, a man named Pete, who had the particular talent of knowing everything and the even rarer talent of knowing which parts of what he knew were worth sharing, wiped the counter slowly. Wick was in last night, Pete said. Late. Left around midnight. He say anything? Not to me. Pete set down his rag. He was talking to someone in the back corner for about an hour. Man I didn't recognize, rode in from the north. What'd he look like? Didn't look like anything specific. Average height, kept his hat on. Pete paused. Paid for Wick's drinks, which Wick doesn't normally let anyone do. Silas nodded. He left without his coffee. He spent the next 3 hours making himself useful in a general way around the north end of town, checking on a horse he'd boarded at the remaining livery, stopping to talk to Jim Cutter about the fence repairs, standing at the edge of the canyon overlook for 20 minutes, looking at nothing in particular. What he was actually doing was mapping the northern terrain in his memory more carefully than he had before, thinking about water access and trail visibility and where a man might move a small herd without being seen from the road. The canyon ran northeast, deep enough to swallow sound and shadow both. The trails down into it were old, older than Red Hollow, some of them, used by people who'd been in this territory long before the settlement existed. Most had been abandoned when the main road was built. Silas knew 2 of them from his survey of the eastern pastures. He hadn't thought about them seriously until now. He thought about them very seriously now. He thought about them all the way through town and down Settlers Row and up to the door of Quinn's Alterations, which was, by the time he arrived, open for business. Mara looked up when he came in. She took one look at his face and said, "What did you find?" He told her about the boot prints. She listened without interrupting, her hand still on the coat she was working on. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The alley's been disturbed before," she said. "I thought it was kids." "When?" "Twice last week. Once the week before." She said it carefully, like she was acknowledging something she'd been successfully not thinking about. "I didn't want to be the kind of person who assumes the worst about shadows." "How late do you work?" "Late." "Mara, I know." She set down the coat. Her voice was controlled, but her jaw was tight. "I know what you're going to say." "I'm not going to tell you to be scared," he said. "I'm going to tell you to be more careful than you have been, which is a different thing." She looked at him steadily. "Someone is watching my shop. Someone is watching who comes and goes from your shop." He sat on the customer stool. "I think they're watching me, and I think they know I've been asking questions about the cattle disappearances." He paused. "Which means someone told them I was asking." The implication sat between them. "You think there's someone in town," she said. "I think what you thought 10 days ago was more right than either of us realized." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Wick, and whoever he met last night, and whoever is watching this shop, that's not a coincidence. That's coordination." Mara stood up and walked to her small window. She looked at the alley across the street for a long moment. She had her arms crossed in that way she did when she was thinking hard and wanted to look like she wasn't, holding herself together, processing fast behind a still face. "If it's coordinated," she said slowly, "then whoever is running it inside this town knows how Red Hollow works. They know its patterns, its schedules." She turned from the window. "They knew about the town meeting." Everybody knew about the town meeting, but they would have heard how it went, how much suspicion landed on outsiders, how little landed on anyone here. She looked at him directly. "If I were running this from inside, I would have found the meeting very reassuring." Silas felt something cold settle in his thinking. The Harlan gang theory. It gave whoever is doing this a very convenient direction for the town to look. She uncrossed her arms. "I'm not saying it was planned. I'm saying it was useful. And someone who's patient enough to take cattle in small numbers over 3 weeks is smart enough to know when something's useful." He was quiet. Outside, the wind picked up and rattled the sign above the door. Buckwheat dropped from the windowsill to the floor with a soft thud and disappeared behind the counter. "Supper," Silas said. Mara blinked. "What?" "You said supper. Thursday. I'm still here." He looked at her. "Or we can keep talking about cattle thieves if you prefer." Something crossed her face that was close to a smile but didn't quite finish the journey. "You're strange," she said. "Probably." He looked around the shop. "What do you need?" "I have a pot of something on the stove in back," she said. "It's not elegant. I've eaten dried beef and creek water for 3 days running and called it a good week," he said. "I'm not looking for elegant." She held his gaze for a beat, then turned toward the back room. "Close the front," she said over her shoulder, "and don't touch anything on my work table." He closed the front and didn't touch anything on her work table. The back room was small, not much more than a narrow kitchen with an iron stove, a table with 2 mismatched chairs, a shelf of provisions that was honest about the margin she lived on, and a window that faced the back wall of the adjacent building. It was clean, thoroughly clean, the way spaces get when the person in them has very little and takes care of what they have. A hook by the door held a coat and a scarf. The table had been set with 2 plates, which she had clearly done earlier and was now pretending she hadn't. He noticed and said nothing about it. The something on the stove was a beef and root vegetable stew, It smelled significantly better than it had any right to, given the limited provisions on the shelf. She served it without ceremony and sat across from him, and they ate in the first genuinely comfortable silence he'd experienced in longer than he could remember. "Tell me about before Red Hollow," she said eventually. He looked up. "What about it?" "Whatever you want." She was looking at her bowl. "You don't have to." He thought about it for a moment. "I drove cattle for 12 years, started in Texas, worked north, had a partner named Cliff who died crossing the Platte 3 winters ago." He paused. "He was my brother." She looked up. "I'm sorry." "It was fast," he said, which was the thing people usually said and which was true and which never made it easier. "We were crossing in high water. He went in trying to pull out a calf that had gone under. The current—" He stopped. "It was fast," he said again. Mara was quiet in the way that wasn't absence, the kind of quiet that's actually attention. "After that I stopped driving," he said, "bought grazing rights here and there. Tried to stay put somewhere." He looked around the small kitchen. Red Hollow stuck more than most places. Why? He considered giving her a simpler answer. He decided against it. "Because there's something real here underneath the noise," he said. "Most places I've been scratch the surface, and there's nothing holding it up except money and habit. Here, people are actually trying at something." He paused, "even if they do it badly." She let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. "That's a generous interpretation. I didn't say they succeed." This time, the smile made it all the way. It changed her face in a way he hadn't been able to fully anticipate. Not beautiful in the conventional sense, but vivid, present, like a lantern turned up. "And you?" he asked. "Before this?" The smile faded, not unhappily, but thoughtfully. "Ohio," she said. "My mother was a seamstress. Taught me young. Father left when I was 11, which was honestly less disruptive than you'd expect because he wasn't useful when he was there either." She said this without bitterness, just recitation. "Mother died when I was 22. I had the tools and the skill and no particular reason to stay in a place that already knew everything about me." She looked at her bowl. "I came west because that's what people do when they need to start over as a stranger." "Has it worked?" She made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite not one. "I'm still a stranger here," she said. "I've just been here long enough that they've gotten used to ignoring me in specific personal ways rather than general ones." He looked at her across the small table and said, "They're going to have to find something new to do with themselves." She met his eyes. She held his gaze for a beat longer than was casual. Then she looked back at her bowl and said, "Eat before it gets cold." He ate. The stew was better than anything he'd had in months. He told her so. She looked faintly pleased and immediately deflected it. They talked about the cattle situation again after supper, which was not romantic but was honest. And honesty was the thing between them, he was realizing, that ran deeper than any of the rest of it. He told her what he planned to do about Wick. She told him why half of that plan was going to get him into trouble, and suggested modifications, 2 of which he immediately recognized as better than his original idea and adopted without argument, which seemed to surprise her. "You actually listen," she said, "when someone's worth listening to." He stood to leave. It was past 8, and the wind outside was audible through the walls. "The boot prints concern me," he said. "I want you to bolt the back as well as the front." "I always bolt the back." "Good. Don't change your habits. Don't give anyone reason to think you've noticed anything." He pulled on his coat, the repaired coat, the one with the reinforced seam. "And if something feels wrong, you get to me. Not the sheriff, not anyone else. Me." She looked up at him from her chair with an expression that he was starting to learn, the one where she was deciding how much to let something show. "You're very certain about that." "Yes," he said simply. The words sat in the small kitchen. She didn't argue with it. He left through the back, cutting through the alley behind Settlers Row to avoid the street, and rode north through a darkness that was thick and absolute, making a wide arc toward the canyon overlook. He stopped there for a long time, looking down into the black slot of the canyon, listening. Nothing. Wind, the far sound of cattle from the eastern pastures. But when he rode back through town, he swung past the alley across from Quinn's alterations one more time. He pulled up, sat, waited 5 minutes in the cold without moving, and 50 yards north, in the shadow of the collapsed storage shed where no shadow should have been moving at this hour, something moved. Silas didn't follow it. Not yet. He filed the location, the direction of movement, the approximate height and build, and he kept riding, easy and unhurried, the way a man rides when he doesn't know he's seen anything. He knew one thing more than he had this morning. Whoever was watching Mara's shop, they were local. They moved through the back ways of Red Hollow with the ease of someone who'd learned them by living here. They weren't a scout from outside. They were someone's neighbor. He got back to his lodgings and sat on the edge of his bed in his coat and boots for a while, thinking about Dale Wick and boot prints and canyon trails and a woman across town who'd set 2 plates out for supper and pretended she hadn't. He thought about Cliff, who used to say that the real trouble with range work wasn't the weather or the cattle or the distance. It was that you had nobody to think out loud with. Silas had spent 3 years proving him right. He lay back, not expecting to sleep, and fell asleep in minutes. He found the connection to Wick on a Saturday morning, and he found it because of a button. Mara had mentioned it almost in passing 4 days after Thursday supper, while she was sorting through a basket of uncollected repairs, garments left by customers who'd never come back for them, which happened more often than people would imagine. She held up a man's work jacket, heavy canvas, the kind worn by ranch hands. "This came in 6 weeks ago," she said. "Man said he'd be back in 2 days. Never came." Silas looked at it. Description: average, quiet, paid in advance, which is unusual. She turned the jacket over. He'd torn the pocket off practically, asked me to replace both front pockets and reinforce the lining. She pointed to the interior, where she'd sewn a stiffened panel along the chest. People do that when they're carrying something heavy on one side. Documents, sometimes. Or a second firearm. Or cash. Or cash. She folded it. I don't know why I kept thinking about it. Probably nothing. What was unusual about him? She paused. His boots, she said. Right boot had a repair on the sole, interior edge, harder leather patch. Silas went very still. She noticed. Her eyes sharpened. "You've seen that boot." "In the mud," he said. "Across the street." They looked at each other across the work table in the specific silence of 2 people realizing simultaneously that something they'd been treating as separate threads was actually the same thread. "He was casing the shop even then," she said. Her voice was flat, not frightened. She was controlling the fear, which he was beginning to understand was how she handled most difficult things. Feel it, file it, keep moving. Or casing who visited it. Silas turned the jacket over in his hands, examining the collar. There was a button missing from the top. Not torn, just gone. The thread worn through from use. The remaining buttons were stamped brass, distinctive in a particular way he couldn't immediately place. "Can I take this?" "It won't help the man get his jacket back. That's not why I want it." She handed it over without asking for further explanation, which was one of the things about her he'd stopped being surprised by and started simply appreciating. He spent the afternoon in a systematic way that would have looked, to a casual observer, like a man running ordinary errands. Feed store. Livery. Brief conversation with Jim Cutter at the north fence line. But what he was actually doing was comparing. He was looking at buttons. He found the match at Gerald Holt's ranch, not on Holt himself, on the tack room wall, where a collection of miscellaneous hardware and spare equipment hung on a row of pegs. Among a scatter of buckles and rings and worn leather straps was a single brass button, identical in stamp to the ones on the uncollected jacket. It meant nothing on its own. Brass buttons from the same supplier were common enough, but combined with everything else, combined with Wick's absences and the canyon trails, and the man who'd stood in Mara's alley, and the thing Mara had said about someone inside the town running this, combined with all of that, it meant the circle was smaller than Silas had been willing to let himself believe. He rode back to town and spent an hour sitting in the saloon with a drink he didn't touch, thinking it through with the kind of careful, reluctant honesty that you have to force yourself toward when the conclusion is something you don't want to reach. Gerald Holt had more cattle than anyone in the valley. He also, Silas now thought with a cold clarity, had the most to gain from a drought that drove smaller ranchers to sell cheap. If other herds were actually disappearing, moved through the canyon trails to somewhere north, the fear that produced would drive men to sell early, sell low, sell to whoever had cash. And Gerald Holt, in a drought, still had cash. It was not proof. It was a theory built from a jacket and a button and a pattern of behavior and Mara's careful observations. But it was the most coherent explanation for the shape of what was happening, and Silas had learned over years of range work that the most coherent explanation was usually the one that was true. He needed more, and getting more was going to require doing something he disliked, which was waiting. He was not good at waiting. He'd never been. Cliff used to say that Silas's patience had a shelf life of about 48 hours, after which it curdled into action whether or not the action was ready. He'd tried to improve this over the years with moderate success. He went back to Mara's shop. She was still working, but it was past 6, and she was still at the work table, finishing a waistcoat repair by lantern light. She looked up when he came in and read his face the way she always did. "You found something?" she said. "I found enough to have a theory," he said. "Not enough to prove it." "Tell me." He told her. All of it. The button, the jacket, the logical chain from Wick to the canyon to Holt. He laid it out the way he would explain a terrain problem, factual and sequential, and she listened without interrupting until he was done. Then she was quiet for a long moment. "Holt," she said. Not a question, just the name, sitting in the air. "I can't prove it yet, but you believe it." "Yes." She set down her work. She turned on her stool to face him fully, which she did when she was thinking at full concentration. "If it's Holt, then Wick is working for him, and Wick knows you've been asking about the cattle disappearances, which means Holt knows." She paused. "Which means you've been walking around this town for 2 weeks as a visible problem for a man who has enough reach to make you invisible." That had occurred to me. "It doesn't seem to be bothering you as much as it should." "I'm bothered," he said. "I'm just not going to let it change how I move." She pressed her lips together. "That's very brave and very stupid." "Probably both," he agreed. "Mara, I need you to think about whether there's anything else you've seen or heard. Anything that felt off. Any customer, any conversation, any repair job that didn't sit right." She looked at the ceiling, that particular unfocused look she got when she was running through memory. He'd come to recognize it as genuine processing, not performance. 3 months ago, she said slowly, a man came in to have a saddlebag waterproofed. Didn't want to wait, said he'd be traveling through wet terrain within the week, paid double to have it done overnight. She paused. He asked me while I worked whether the canyon trails north of town flooded in heavy rain. Silas felt the back of his neck go cold. "What did you say?" I said, "I didn't know. I don't go out that way." She looked at him, but I thought it was an odd question for a man who claimed to be passing through. Because a man passing through would ask directions to the road, not the canyon. "Yes." Her voice was very quiet. "I think I knew it was odd then. I just didn't know what to do with it." "You're doing something with it now." She looked at him steadily. "Is that enough to go to the sheriff with?" Silas thought about August Reese, competent, well-meaning, legitimately under-resourced, and operating in a town where Gerald Holt's name opened doors and closed investigations. "Not yet," he said. "Reese is honest. But honest isn't always enough when the man you're accusing built half the town's economy. So we need something Reese can't ignore, something he can't explain away." Silas looked at the jacket, which he'd brought back with him. "If the gang is moving cattle through the canyon, they have to be holding them somewhere north. A ranch, a box canyon, somewhere with water access. If we could find where—" "We," Mara said. He met her eyes. "You know this territory better than you let on. You hear things, and you think differently than I do." He paused. "Yes, we." The word hung between them with a weight that had nothing to do with the investigation. "Silas." She said his name in a specific way, careful, almost reluctant. "The last time I involved myself in something this town cared about, I got 3 weeks of people leaving garbage outside my door and someone painting a word on my sign that I painted over before you ever saw it." She held his gaze. "I know what it costs me to be visible here." "I know that too," he said. "I'm not asking you to be visible. I'm asking you to help me think." She looked at him for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the street and rattled her sign. The lantern swayed slightly on its hook. "The man with the saddlebag," she said finally. "He smelled like wood smoke and pine resin. Not cedar, pine. There's no pine stands close to Red Hollow. The nearest pine forest is the ridge above Carver's Creek, 14 miles north." Silas sat forward. "That ridge has a box canyon on the east side. Water runs year-round from the snowmelt. I looked at grazing rights up there 2 years ago and passed on them because the access trail was too narrow for regular cattle drives." He stopped. "But not too narrow for moving small numbers quietly at night. You know the trail?" "I know where it starts." She nodded once, slowly. Something had shifted in her expression. Not resolution exactly, but the look of a person who has made a decision and is no longer fighting it. "Then you need to go look." "Not alone." "You just said—" "I said you wouldn't be visible. That's different from alone." He looked at her directly. "I've ridden into uncertain situations alone more times than I can count. I also watched my brother go under a river alone because nobody was positioned to pull him out." His voice was level, but the words cost something. "I'm not too proud to know when I need another set of eyes." Mara was quiet. The comparison wasn't lost on her. She would see. She could see it in his face, the old weight of it, carried without self-pity, but not without pain. "If I go with you," she said carefully, "and something goes wrong, I won't let something go wrong." "You can't promise that." "No," he admitted. "I can't." She was quiet for another moment. Then, "I can ride. I know people think I can't because of—" She stopped, made a brief gesture at herself that was both self-aware and dismissive. "But I learned on my uncle's farm, and I haven't forgotten. I didn't assume you couldn't. Most people do." "I'm not most people either," he said, which was the closest he'd come to throwing her own words back at her, and something in her expression flickered with the recognition. "2 days?" she said. "Give me 2 days to think about the canyon approach. I've repaired gear for every working ranch in this valley. I know which saddlebags can handle rough trail and which ones will fall apart. And I need to think about what we do if we find what you think we'll find." She looked at him steadily. "We find stolen cattle in a box canyon. We've still got nothing that names Holt directly. We need the link. Someone who places him at the coordination point, not just at the bottom of the chain." He looked at her. "You've been thinking about this longer than tonight." "I think about everything longer than I show," she said, which was not a revelation to him, but was, perhaps, the clearest she'd ever stated it. He stood. He picked up the jacket. At the door he paused. "The word they painted on your sign," he said quietly. "What was it?" She met his eyes. She didn't flinch. "The kind of word people use when they want you to feel like less than what you are." A pause. "I painted over it and opened the next morning. That's the entirety of what I gave them." He nodded once. It was not enough. No response to that was enough. But he made sure she saw in his face that he understood what it had cost her to say it and to have lived it and to be standing here anyway. He walked out into the cold night. 2 doors down, a group of men leaving the saloon glanced at him as he came off Settlers Row. One of them, a ranch hand he didn't know by name, said something in a low voice to the others. There was laughter. Silas kept walking without changing pace or expression. He'd heard what the man said. It was about Mara. It was not something he would repeat. He rode out of Red Hollow with the jacket tied across his saddle and the cold absolute around him, and he felt for the first time in this whole business a specific and clarifying anger. Not the hot kind that made men stupid, the slow kind that settled into your chest and stayed there and made you very, very patient. He would find the canyon. He would find the cattle. He would find the link to Holt or Wick or whoever else was standing between Red Hollow and the truth about what was being done to it. And then Red Hollow was going to have to reckon with something it had been avoiding since the moment Mara Quinn arrived at its edges and was judged and filed away and dismissed. That the person they'd worked hardest to ignore had been watching all of them, clearly and accurately, the entire time. He rode north. The mountains were black shapes against a slightly less black sky. Somewhere ahead, past the pine ridge above Carver's Creek, stolen cattle stood in a box canyon and ate grass that didn't belong to them. He was going to find them. The 2 days Mara asked for became 3, because on the second day, Dale Wick disappeared, not fled. That distinction mattered. His horse was still at the livery. His gear was still at his boarding room. He simply stopped appearing where he was expected to appear, which was its own kind of message. A man who flees takes his horse. A man who's been told to lie low stays close and quiet and waits to be useful when the time comes. Silas learned about Wick's absence from Pete at the saloon on a Monday morning, said nothing about it, and went directly to Mara's shop. She already knew. Clara Whitmore's youngest had mentioned it to a woman who'd come in for a hem repair at 7 in the morning, which was how information moved through Red Hollow. Not through official channels, but through the quiet network of people who talked while work was being done. "He's still in town," Mara said, without looking up from the boot she was lacing back together. "He hasn't run. That means whoever is running this told him to wait, which means they're not finished yet." Silas stood at the window looking at the street. The alley across the way was empty in daylight, but he looked at it anyway. Habit now. They're going to move more cattle, probably soon, while the drought keeps everyone distracted and the town is still pointed at the Harlan theory. "Then we don't have 2 more days." She set down the boot. "We go tonight." He turned from the window. "You've decided." "I decided the night you told me about Holt." She said it matter-of-factly, no performance in it. "I just needed the 2 days to think through the approach and stop talking myself out of it." She looked at him steadily. "I know a man named Roy Adder. He runs sheep on the western slope, keeps to himself, doesn't mix with the cattle ranchers, which means he doesn't owe Gerald Holt anything. He also has a wagon with a false panel in the bed that he built for transporting breeding rams without them killing each other." Silas was quiet for a beat. "Why do you know about Roy Adder's wagon?" "Because he brought it to me 3 years ago to reinforce the panel with heavier timber, and he explained what it was for while I worked." A small pause. "I also think he'd lend it to us if I asked. He's got no love for Holt. Holt's men have run his sheep off the eastern water access twice." "What would we use the wagon for?" "Getting close to the canyon without looking like we're surveilling anything." She stood and moved to her work table, where she'd laid out a rough sketch on brown paper. Not a map exactly, more a set of spatial relationships, distances approximated from descriptions she'd gathered over years of listening to customers talk about terrain. The canyon trail starts here, north of the Cutter fence line. A rider on that road at night looks like trouble. A wagon on that road looks like someone moving supplies. She pointed to a mark on the paper. "There's an abandoned way station here, about a mile from the canyon mouth. We could leave the wagon there and go in on foot." He looked at the sketch. It was imprecise in some of its distances, but structurally correct. She'd gotten the shape of it right, the relationship between the road and the trail and the canyon mouth. "You drew this from descriptions, from 6 years of listening to ranchers complain about terrain." He looked at her. "You should have been a general." "I should have been a lot of things." She folded the sketch and handed it to him. "Roy's place is 4 miles west. I'll go this afternoon. You get the horses ready and meet me at the south end of Settlers Row at 9 tonight." "You'll go alone to Adder's?" "He knows me. He doesn't know you. I'll move faster alone." She gave him a look that preempted argument. "I survived in this town long before you arrived, Silas." He took the sketch. 9 o'clock, he said. "Don't be late." "I'm never late," she said, which turned out to be true. She was at the south end of Settlers Row at 5 minutes before 9. Standing beside Roy Adder's wagon in a coat he hadn't seen before. Heavier than her usual one, dark canvas, practical. Her hair was pinned tightly. She dressed for terrain, not for being seen, and there was something in the way she held herself that was different from the woman in the shop. More settled. Like she'd stopped carrying something she usually carried, and her posture had adjusted to the absence. She'd also, he noticed, brought a hunting knife on her belt. "Roy?" he asked, nodding at the wagon. "Lent it without questions after I explained what Holt's men have been doing to his water access." She climbed up to the bench seat with a practicality that didn't invite comment. "He also said, and I'm quoting, that if we found anything useful, we were welcome to borrow his mule to carry the evidence." Good man. Sensible man. There's a difference. Silas tied his horse to the back and climbed up beside her. They moved out of Red Hollow in the dark, heading north on the main road, moving at an easy pace that wouldn't attract attention from anyone watching from the settlement. Neither of them spoke much for the first mile. The cold was serious now. the kind that got into joints and stayed there, and their breath came in visible puffs in the lantern light. "You're not scared," he said. It wasn't a question exactly. "I'm scared," she said. "I'm just not letting it run things." He nodded. "Fair enough." "Are you?" He considered lying, then didn't. "Some. Not about the canyon, about getting this wrong, about having a theory that doesn't hold and dragging you out here in the cold for nothing. Then it's nothing. We go home and I go back to repairing boots and you go back to your grazing rights, and we're cold and annoyed for one night." She kept her eyes on the road ahead. "But if we're right, then things change." "Yes," she said quietly. "Things change." They left the main road at the mark on her sketch and took the narrower track north, which was rough enough to make the wagon complain but passable. The pine smell hit them before they saw the tree line, sharp and cold and clean, in a way the valley air wasn't. Mara had been right about the pine ridge. They were close. The abandoned way station was still standing, barely, 3 walls and most of a roof, enough to shelter the wagon and the horse from easy view. Silas unhitched and tied the horse inside the walls. They went on foot from there, moving in the dark with nothing but a shuttered lantern that Silas opened only briefly when the terrain demanded it. The canyon mouth opened in the rock face like something had split it deliberately. Narrow, maybe 30 feet across at the entrance, widening out into a broader space beyond. Even in the dark, Silas could smell cattle, the unmistakable combined scent of animals and dung and disturbed grass. He put his hand out and touched Mara's arm, stopping them both. She'd already stopped. She'd smelled it too. They stood at the canyon entrance for a full minute, listening. Wind in the rocks, the occasional shift and stamp of animals in the dark. And there, the low orange point of a fire, deep inside the canyon, partially shielded by a rock outcrop. 1 guard, maybe 2. The fire was small, which meant whoever built it was trying not to be seen from the canyon entrance, which meant they were more worried about approach from outside than they were careless. These weren't amateurs. Silas leaned close to Mara and said, almost without sound, "Stay here." She put her hand on his arm, not grabbing, just pressure. She shook her head once, very slightly, and pointed to the right side of the canyon entrance, where the rock face had a natural ledge running upward at a walkable angle. From that ledge, Silas could see immediately, you would have a view down into the broader canyon interior. A surveying position, not an approach. He looked at the ledge. He looked at her. He nodded. They split. He moved along the left wall of the canyon entrance, staying close to the rock where the shadow was deepest. She moved to the right ledge and started climbing, slowly, testing each foothold before she committed to it. He watched her go. She moved carefully, without rushing, and she was quiet. Genuinely quiet, not trying to be quiet, which was the harder thing. He made it 30 yards into the canyon before he could see the full picture. There were cattle. He couldn't count them in the dark, but the mass of bodies filling the canyon floor was significant. 24 minimum, possibly more. And there were 2 men at the fire, both seated, one with a rifle across his knees, both bundled against the cold. At the far end of the canyon, partially visible in the firelight, was a rough rope corral with additional horses. 4 horses. 2 men visible, which meant 2 men were likely sleeping somewhere beyond the fire, out of his sight line. He pulled back carefully and returned to the canyon entrance. He waited. 3 minutes later, Mara came down from the ledge. Her hands were scraped from the rock, and she was breathing harder than the climb alone would account for. 4 men total, she said, barely above a breath. 2 sleeping against the far wall under canvas. Cattle are branded. I couldn't read all of them from the ledge, but I could see at least 2 different ranch brands, which is Miller's and Cutter's. She paused. And there's a logbook of some kind on the ground next to the fire. One of the men has been writing in it. Silas felt something sharpen in his chest. A record. Why would they keep a record? Because someone is paying them by the head. They need a count that matches what they deliver. He looked back toward the canyon interior, thinking, if we could get that book. We can't get that book, Mara said, and her voice was the firm, reasonable voice she used when she was preventing him from doing something that felt right, but was actually reckless. 2 men awake, 2 sleeping, 4 horses. If they hear anything, they'll be on those horses before we clear the canyon mouth. And if they catch us, there's no version of that story that ends well. He knew she was right. He disliked knowing she was right. "We have the cattle," he said. "We have the brands. That's enough for Reese to come out here with men and make it official. It's enough to show him where. It's not enough to show him who ordered it." She was thinking again. That ceiling look, even in near total darkness, her eyes slightly unfocused. The logbook has a count. If the count matches the missing numbers from Miller's and Cutter's herds exactly, that's hard to explain away. But we need to know who the book reports to. She looked at him. "Wick." "Wick is lying low. Wick is lying low because someone told him to," she said. "And if Holt is running this, Wick doesn't know everything. He's a foreman, not a partner. He knows the piece he was given. He knows the canyon. He knows the timing. He probably knows the count." She paused. "But he doesn't know we're standing 30 yards from his operation right now." Silas looked at her in the dark. "You want to use him. I want to give him a choice." She crossed her arms against the cold, her voice careful and precise. "If Wick understands that we have the canyon and the cattle and the brands, and we're going to Reese regardless, his choice is whether he goes down as the man who ran the whole operation or as the man who was working for someone bigger and told the truth about it." She met his eyes. "Wick isn't Gerald Holt. He doesn't have Holt's land or Holt's money or Holt's lawyers. He has a lot more to lose from being made the face of this than Holt does, and he probably knows it." The cold wind moved through the canyon mouth around them. Inside, the fire flickered against the rock walls, and the cattle shifted in their sleep, and the two men kept watch over something that was already over. They just didn't know it yet. "When?" Silas said. "Tomorrow morning, early, before Holt can reach him. You go to Wick's boarding room, you tell him what we found, and you give him until noon to decide." She looked at him steadily. "And you make it clear that the noon deadline is real." "What are you doing while I'm with Wick?" "I'm going to Reese." She said it before he could suggest it, which told him she'd been planning this sequence for longer than the past hour. "Not with everything, just enough to get him to the canyon by afternoon. If Wick talks, Reese arrives and finds both the cattle and a man willing to name names. If Wick doesn't talk, Reese still finds the cattle with brands, and the trail leads back to town on its own eventually." Silas was quiet for a moment, looking at her in the dark. "You planned this before we left tonight." "I planned for this possibility." She shifted her weight. Her scraped hands were going to be painful in this cold, and she hadn't mentioned them once. "There's a difference." "Not much of one." "Enough." She turned toward the canyon entrance. "We should go. Standing here is what gets us caught." They moved back through the dark, retraced their steps to the way station, hitched the horse, and drove south in silence for a while. The cold had gotten worse. Mara sat with her hands in her lap, and he could see, when the lantern caught them right, that the scrapes on her palms were worse than she'd let on. "Give me your hands," he said. "They're fine." "Mara." She held them out with the expression of someone tolerating something unnecessary. He wrapped the bandana from his pocket around the worst of the right palm and tied it off. She watched him do this without comment. "You were right about the ledge," he said. "I would have gone straight in." "Yes." "That would have been a problem." "Also, yes." She looked at her wrapped hand. "You're good in a crisis. You're not good at anticipating one." "That's a fair assessment." "I know." She pulled her hands back, folded them in her lap. "Silas, if Wick doesn't talk, if Holt has enough reach to make Reese look the other way, what do we do?" It was the first time since Thursday's supper that he'd heard something approaching genuine fear in her voice. Not of the physical danger that she'd handled without flinching, but of the older, harder fear. The fear of someone who's lived on the margins long enough to know that the margin doesn't protect you when powerful men decide you're a problem. He didn't offer her false reassurance. She'd see through it, and it would cost him more than the comfort was worth. "Then we go above Reese," he said. "The Territorial Marshal's office in Denver. We have the brands, we have the location, we have your testimony about the man with the saddlebag and the jacket, and the questions about the canyon trails. That's a paper trail." He kept his eyes on the road. "It takes longer, but it holds." She was quiet. "I'm not going to let this bury you," he said. "I want to be plain about that." She looked at him for a moment. Not the calculating look, not the careful look. Something more unguarded than usual. "You say that like it's simple." "It's not simple, but it's true." which matters more than whether it's simple. She looked back at the road. After a moment, she said very quietly, I've been doing things alone for a long time. I know. I don't know how to do this, whatever this is. A pause. I don't know the rules. There aren't rules, he said. There's just what happens and how you handle it. She made a small sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else entirely. That's not reassuring. It wasn't meant to be reassuring. It was meant to be honest. They came over the last rise and Red Hollow opened up below them. Its scattered lights dim and cold in the dark. It looked smaller from up here. Fragile, almost, like something that could be unmade by one bad season, which wasn't far from true. Mara looked at it for a moment before they started down. Tomorrow, she said, 9 in the morning. You go to Wick. 9 in the morning, he agreed. She nodded once. She straightened her spine against the cold and looked at the road ahead, and there was in her posture something that he recognized from the hardest moments in his own life. The specific set of a person who is tired and a little scared and not going to let either of those things make decisions for them. He drove them back into Red Hollow, and they parted at the south end of Settlers Row without ceremony, because ceremony wasn't what they were. She walked back to her shop. He rode to his lodgings. The town was quiet around them both. In 7 hours, one of them was going to walk into a situation that might go badly, and the other was going to walk into the office of a man who might or might not be brave enough to act on what he heard. Neither of them slept particularly well. Silas was at Dale Wick's boarding room door at 8:55 in the morning. He knocked twice, not loudly, the kind of knock that says, I know you're in there and we both know you're not going anywhere. There was a long pause on the other side of the door, long enough that Silas could picture the man sitting on his bed, still dressed from a night he hadn't slept through, trying to calculate whether or not answering was a viable option. It wasn't, and Wick seemed to arrive at that conclusion on his own, because the door opened. Dale Wick was a big man going soft in the middle, with the particular look of someone who'd spent years doing physical work and had recently stopped. The muscles still there underneath, but blurred now, like a photograph left in the sun. He had the red-rimmed eyes of a man who'd been awake too long, and the careful stillness of one who knew he was in trouble and was trying not to show how much. Boone, he said. His voice was flat. Morning, Silas said. Can I come in? Wick looked at him for a moment, then he stepped back from the door. The room was small, the bed unmade, a half-eaten meal on the side table that had been there long enough to be unpleasant. Wick sat on the room's single chair. Silas stayed standing, which wasn't a power move so much as a practical one. The chair was the only place to sit, and he wanted Wick comfortable enough to talk. I'm going to tell you what I know, Silas said, and then I'm going to give you a choice. That's the entirety of why I'm here. Wick's jaw tightened. I don't know what you think you... Box Canyon above Carver's Creek, Silas said. Pine Ridge on the north slope. 26 head, minimum, carrying Miller and Cutter brands. 2 men awake, 2 sleeping. Logbook by the fire with a running count. He paused. I was there last night. I counted. The color in Wick's face shifted in a way that confirmed everything Silas needed confirmed. The man's hands tightened on his knees. He said nothing. Sheriff Reese is getting that information this morning, Silas continued. He'll ride out this afternoon with enough men to make it official. The cattle will be recovered. The men in the canyon will be taken. He looked at Wick steadily. The question isn't whether any of that happens. It's already happening. The question is where you end up in the story that gets told afterward. Wick was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and careful, like a man testing ice before he puts his weight on it. What kind of choice are you offering? You tell me who gave the orders. Who coordinated the timing? Who was being paid on the other end of that logbook count? Silas let the silence sit. You do that, and you're the man who helped stop it, not the man who ran it. That's the difference between a trial in Red Hollow with Gerald Holt's lawyers pointing at you and a conversation with a territorial marshal where you're the one doing the talking. The name landed on Wick like a physical weight. His shoulders dropped half an inch. Something behind his eyes gave way. Not relief, exactly. More like the particular exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something heavy for too long and has just been given permission to set it down, even if the setting down comes with consequences. He said it was temporary, Wick said. His voice had changed, flatter, more honest. Said the drought was pushing everybody hard, and this was a way to move the market. Buy out the struggling ranches at low prices. Build the herd back up by spring when prices recovered. He made it sound almost... He stopped. He pressed his mouth shut. I knew it wasn't right. I'm not... I knew. I know you knew, Silas said. Not to make him feel better. Because it was true. And because Wick needed to hear that pretending otherwise wasn't going to work. He's got a buyer north of the territory line, Wick said. Man named Coulter, running a feedlot operation in Wyoming. The cattle get moved through the canyon in small numbers, rebranded at a holding ranch 12 miles north of Carver's Creek, sold to Coulter with clean paperwork. He looked at his hands. The logbook is a count for Holt. He gets paid per head delivered, minus the operating cost for the men in the canyon. Is that in writing anywhere, the arrangement with Holt? Wick reached under the mattress and produced a folded envelope. His hand was not steady. He sent this 4 weeks ago. Instructions for the next phase, larger numbers, faster pace. He wanted to accelerate before winter closed the northern trails. He held it out. I kept it because... I don't know why I kept it. Insurance, maybe. Or maybe I just couldn't make myself throw it away. Silas took the envelope. He opened it and read it carefully. It was written in Holt's own hand. Direct, precise, incriminating in the way that only truly arrogant men's written instructions tend to be. The kind of letter written by a man who's never seriously considered getting caught. You'll give this to Reese, Silas said. Yes. And you'll tell him everything you told me. Wick nodded. He looked diminished. Not physically, but in some harder-to-define way, like something that had been propping him up from inside had been removed. What happens to me? Silas was honest. I don't know exactly. That's between you and Reese and whatever the law decides. But I'll tell him you cooperated. That's all I can offer. Wick nodded again. He looked at the wall. I've known Mara Quinn since she opened that shop, he said unexpectedly. She fixed my winter coat 3 years running, never charged me full price. A pause. I heard what people said about her, about you and her. I didn't say anything, but I never... He stopped. You don't have to tell me that, Silas said. I know, He rubbed his face with both hands. I just want to say it. Silas left him there to get dressed and walked directly to August Reese's office. Reese was already at his desk, which told Silas that Mara had been there before him, because the sheriff had the look of a man who had recently received news that had ruined his morning in a way he was still processing. He was a lean, methodical man in his mid-40s with a lawman's habit of hearing everything twice before responding to any of it. He listened to Silas without interrupting. When Silas laid Holt's letter on the desk, Reese read it through twice. Then he set it down and sat back in his chair and was quiet for a moment in a way that was not comfortable. This is Gerald Holt, Reese said. Yes. Gerald Holt, who owns 300 head and the North Water rights and half the timber contract for the county. Yes. And you're telling me Dale Wick is prepared to say this to my face, on record. He's at his boarding room right now. He's ready to come here. Silas looked at him directly. I know this is complicated, August. I know what Holt represents in this valley. I'm asking you to do your job in spite of that. Reese looked at him for a long moment. His expression was not offended. It was the expression of a man taking an honest measure of himself against a difficult demand. The canyon, he said finally. You're certain about what you saw? I was standing 30 yards from the fire. The brands on those cattle are Millers and Cutters. If you ride out today, they'll still be there. Reese picked up the letter again. He held it the way a man holds something he wishes he could put down. Who else knows about this? Mara Quinn. Reese's eyes moved. The seamstress. She's the one who connected the pattern in the first place, Silas said. She put together pieces over 6 years of listening to this town that nobody else bothered to look at. He kept his voice even. She's the reason we found the canyon. That's not an exaggeration. Reese was quiet. Then he stood up, which was its own kind of answer. I'll need 4 men, he said. I'll ride at noon. He reached for his coat. Tell Wick to come in within the hour. Silas left the sheriff's office and walked back out into the cold morning street. He stood on the step for a moment, breathing. His chest felt strange. Not quite relief, not quite fear. Something between them, the particular state of a situation that's in motion and hasn't yet resolved into whatever it's going to be. He walked to Quinn's alterations. She was behind the counter when he came in, but she wasn't working. She was standing with her arms crossed, waiting, which was unlike her. She never just stood and waited. She filled every minute with something productive. The waiting told him how much this morning had cost her. "Reese," she said. "He's going. Noon." Silas set Holt's letter on the counter between them. "Wick gave me this. It's Holt's handwriting, and it names Coulter in Wyoming as the buyer." Reese read it. Mara looked at the letter without touching it. Her jaw was tight. "Holt is going to say it's fabricated." "Maybe. But Wick's testimony and the cattle brands and the men in the canyon corroborate it." He watched her face. "How was Reese with you?" She was quiet for a moment. "Polite," she said. "He was polite. He listened." A pause. "He asked me twice whether I was certain about what I'd seen. He didn't ask you that, I'm guessing." "No," Silas said. "He didn't." She nodded once, accepting this with the resignation of someone who has long stopped being surprised by it. "Did he take it seriously anyway?" "He's writing at noon." She uncrossed her arms. She breathed out slowly. "All right," she said. "All right." What happened next in Red Hollow happened the way most things do. Not cleanly, not quickly, and with more mess than the simple version of the story would have you believe. Reese rode to the canyon at noon with 4 deputies and came back at dusk with 29 cattle, 3 men in irons. One had run and been caught half a mile up the ridge. And the logbook, which did in fact contain a running count that matched the missing numbers from Miller's and Cutter's tallies, with a precision that no defense lawyer was going to explain away easily. Gerald Holt was brought in for questioning the following morning. He came in on his own, which was the move of a man confident in his position, and he had a lawyer from Denver present within 48 hours, which was the move of a man who'd understood immediately that his position was worse than he'd thought. He said the letter was taken out of context, then said it might be a forgery, then said Dale Wick was a disgruntled employee with a grievance. He said these things in different combinations for several weeks. It didn't hold. Not with the logbook, not with Wick's testimony, not with the Coulter operation in Wyoming, where a federal inquiry eventually recovered records of 14 separate purchases with rebranded cattle tracing back to Red Hollow Valley dates. Holt's lawyer was good enough to negotiate the charges down, good enough to keep his client out of a territorial prison. But the land holdings were frozen during the investigation. The water rights were suspended. And Gerald Holt, who had walked into Red Hollow's social architecture as a foundational pillar, walked out of the investigation as something smaller and quieter that nobody quite looked at the same way again. Wick was charged. He pled to reduced counts in exchange for his testimony and spent 8 months in the territorial facility before release. When he came back through Red Hollow the following autumn, he stopped at Quinn's alterations and had a winter coat repaired without making conversation. Mara charged him fair price. That was the entirety of what passed between them, and neither of them needed it to be more. The harder thing, the slower thing, was what happened inside the town itself. Because Red Hollow didn't wake up one morning transformed. That's not how places work, and anyone who tells you differently is selling something. What happened was more gradual and less comfortable than transformation. It was more like a long, reluctant adjustment to a fact that couldn't be avoided. The fact was this. The person who had done the most to save their settlement was a woman most of them had spent years treating as scenery. Bert Cutter was the first to say it out loud at a town meeting in late November, and he said it badly and with an awkwardness that suggested he'd rehearsed it and still couldn't quite land it. But he said it, which counted for something. He stood up in the saloon with his hat in his hands and said that he owed Mara Quinn an acknowledgement and that his cattle were home because of her, and he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. There was a silence in the room. And then one by one, other people nodded. Some of them spoke. Some of them didn't, but the nodding was real, and the room felt it. Clara Whitmore came to the shop the following week with a basket of goods. Not charity, which Mara would have returned, but materials she'd heard Mara needed. Thread, a good quality beeswax block, a length of sturdy canvas. She set it on the counter and said, "I want you to know I'm sorry for the things I've said and the things I've let be said." It was brief and imperfect, and Claire's face was red the entire time she said it, but she said it. Mara thanked her without making it easy or difficult. She didn't perform forgiveness that she hadn't finished feeling yet. She just thanked her and moved on, which was, in its own way, more dignified than most of the apologies she'd ever received. The wealthy widows, Hetty Vance included, became quieter presences. Not gone, just quieter, which was all Silas had ever wanted from them. Hetty, to her credit, said nothing publicly against Mara after the canyon. She had enough self-awareness to understand that she'd lost something she'd never had a claim to, and she carried that with her private dignity intact, which Silas respected more than he would have expected to. The changes to Mara's daily life were not dramatic. That's important to say. The town didn't flip overnight from mockery to celebration. Human nature doesn't reorganize itself that fast, and anyone who expects it to is going to be consistently disappointed by people. What changed was smaller and more durable. The quality of the silence when she walked into a room. The way customers spoke to her when they came in. The fact that she was, for the first time, asked to contribute her opinion on community matters. Not formally, not ceremonially, but in the way that happens when people have stopped editing you out. The Miller family invited her to supper in December, which she attended with the specific discomfort of someone unused to being included. She sat at a table with 5 people who had recovered 23 of their cattle and ate a meal that was good and plain and sat in a house that was warm, and when she got home that night, she sat in her kitchen for a while without doing anything, which was, for Mara Quinn, about as close to emotional overwhelm as she permitted herself in private. Buckwheat sat on the table and regarded her without sympathy, which she found oddly steadying. Silas, for his part, was not changed by Red Hollow in any dramatic way either. He was the same man he'd been, careful, not given to speeches, better with action than sentiment. He helped rebuild the Miller fence line through December. He assisted Reese with the paperwork trail to Denver, which was tedious and important and nobody's idea of heroism. He was visible in Red Hollow, in the quiet, practical way that good men tend to be visible, doing things that need doing without requiring an audience for it. He and Mara didn't have a single defining conversation that drew a clear line between what they'd been and what they became. That's not how it works, usually, with people who have been careful with themselves for a long time. What happened was an accumulation. More suppers, more evenings on her small back step when the weather allowed, more conversations that ran past midnight and then past 1 in the morning, more of the specific comfortable silence that only exists between people who have been afraid together and come out the other side still trusting each other. He moved his gear to the lodgings at the north end of Settlers Row in January, which put him 2 buildings from her shop. He told himself this was practical. She did not tell him otherwise, which was how they communicated things they weren't quite ready to name directly. In February, she asked him to help her rehang her shop sign, which had been slowly tilting for 3 years and had finally listed to an angle she couldn't correct from a ladder alone. He held the sign while she drove the new bracket, and when it was level, she stepped back and looked at it with the particular satisfaction of someone who has fixed a thing that needed fixing. Quinn's alterations and repair. Straight now, newly painted, the letters she'd repainted herself in October when she'd painted over the word she hadn't told Silas, but that he'd never forgotten she'd mentioned. She looked at it for a long moment. "Better," she said. "Yeah," he said. She looked at him sideways. I want to say something without it coming out wrong. Try anyway." She pressed her lips together briefly. "I've spent a long time being the person things happen to," she said. "The town's opinions, the poverty, the... She gestured, that brief self-referential motion. "All of it, things that happen to me that I respond to." A pause. "This is the first time in a long time that I feel like I did something. That the outcome was different because of what I specifically chose to do." He looked at her. "It was," he said. "There's no version of this that works without you. Not the canyon, not the logbook, not any of it." "I know," she said, which surprised him slightly. Not the confidence of it, but the ease. She wasn't deflecting or qualifying. She'd accepted it as true. "I just wanted to say it out loud." He nodded. They stood in the cold February street looking at the level sign, and he thought about Cliff, who used to say that the real measure of a place wasn't its land or its weather, but whether the people in it made you better at being yourself or worse. He thought Red Hollow, with all its flaws and its cruelties and its slow, reluctant adjustments, had managed the former, at least in the end. He wasn't entirely sure it deserved the credit for that. He thought the credit mostly belonged to the woman standing next to him. "Supper tonight?" he said. "I have a backlog of repairs," she said. "I'll help." She looked at him. "You don't know how to sew. You could teach me." She considered this with the same serious attention she gave most things. "You'll be bad at it," she said. "Probably. You'll pull the thread too tight and pucker the seam." "More than likely." She turned back toward her shop door. 6 o'clock, she said. "And don't touch my good needle." He smiled at her back. She didn't see it, or she pretended not to, which with Mara Quinn amounted to the same thing. Red Hollow went on the way small places do, imperfectly, stubbornly, carrying its history and its timber, and its grudges, and its occasional surprising capacity for decency. Spring came slowly that year, the way spring always comes after a bad winter. Grudging at first, a few warm days followed by cold snaps that made everyone feel cheated, and then, gradually, the real thing. The creek rose. The grass came back. Ranchers who'd sold early cursed their timing, and ranchers who'd held on counted their animals with the particular relief of people who'd survived something close. The canyon above Carver's Creek was empty by spring. Roy Adder's wagon was returned with a good wheel repair that Silas had done himself, which Roy said was unnecessary and Silas had done anyway, because that was the kind of man he was. Mara Quinn, in the spring, was asked by 3 different families to consult on their fence designs, which was not her specialty, but apparently her reputation now extended to practical problem-solving in a general sense, which she found faintly absurd and chose to be useful about. She still repaired boots and coats and worn-out things that people brought her. She still worked by lantern past hours that were good for her eyes. She still had opinions she didn't always voice and a cat named Buckwheat who contributed nothing. But when she walked down Settlers Row, people looked at her the way they look at someone they know. Not a stranger in the edges, not scenery, someone whose name they know and whose opinion they've stopped assuming has no value. It was not a perfect outcome. There is no such thing. There were still people in Red Hollow who'd never fully reorganized what they thought of her, and she knew it, and she didn't spend her energy on them. She spent it on the work in front of her, and the people who'd earned her time and the slow, private business of trusting someone, of letting Silas Boone sit in her kitchen at 6 in the evening, pulling thread too tight and puckering seams and being corrected, which he accepted without ego and then did marginally better the next time. He was never going to be a seamstress. But he learned, which is the thing that matters. You learn the skill in front of you. You get better, imperfectly, over time. That's the only version of any story that's worth telling. Not the one where everything resolves and everyone is changed and the world comes out clean and clear on the other side. But the one where people who'd been looking past each other finally stopped and looked and found something real enough to hold on to through a hard season and out the other side. The Cowboy's unexpected choice. That's what they called it in Red Hollow for years after. Half mocking at first, then just descriptive. Then eventually said with a different weight entirely, the way a town says something when it stopped being a story about one man and started being part of what the place understands about itself. What Silas Boone chose, in the end, was exactly what it looked like. A woman who saw clearly, worked honestly, and had been surviving without recognition for long enough that she'd stopped needing it from anyone she didn't respect. The town took a while to be worth her respect. Most things worth having take a while. She gave it when she was ready, on her own terms, at her own pace. That too was exactly what it looked like.